Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. And as we opened today, we talked about the fraud being perpetrated on the American people and then the counter to it, the pursuit of real justice, which is essential to our freedom. And sticking with the alliterative theme here, General Flynn's name I might have mentioned briefly before. But I want to put into context a little bit why his particular case is so substantial, and hopefully a little bit later we're actually going to talk with his lead counsel right now, Sidney Powell, which I'm very excited to talk with her about some of the latest revelations in his case, including the news this week that he will be seeking to withdraw his guilty plea and maybe finally correct for the grave injustice that has been his entire plight. We'll talk a little bit about why he got embroiled in this in the first place, namely because he had a conversation with a Russian official, a counterpart, while he was incoming national security advisor, and that was swept up in this whole Russia collusion, treacherous conspiracy thing. And then they said he lied about it, even though it's a perfectly lawful conversation. But anyway, we'll get to those details and the nitty-gritty of it with Sidney Powell, hopefully, very shortly. Julie Kelly wrote a great article I urge you to read at American Greatness this week on the unequal fates of a real Obama-era whistleblower versus the Trump-era whistleblower. And that whistleblower was General Flynn. And his whistleblowing was not really released to the public until recently when the Washington Post put out what they called the Afghanistan papers, which were actual on the field, on the battlefield accounts of those senior level and on down in our federal government who were fighting in that theater, executing, supposedly on the American people's behalf, and explaining to the Inspector General, in this case, for the Afghanistan reconstruction efforts, giving accounts of their honest view of what was occurring in the field, what we were doing right, what we were doing wrong. And among the interviews was none other than General Flynn, who, of course, would become the head of the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, in the Obama administration, which in and of itself is kind of amazing that he rose to that level, given how antithetical his worldview is to the Obama worldview, which I would say is probably a testament to his competence, that in spite of the fact that he was anti-political correctness, that he took a very hard line on Islamic supremacism, that he had a clear-eyed view of the adversaries facing us, even in the Obama administration, he had to rise to the position he did. Why? Because he was that competent and good at hunting down terrorists, which was his primary job for much of the 30-plus years. Certainly, arguably the most important job in his 30-plus years of service. I believe, and I've elucidated this theory to some extent in writing, that General Flynn was really the first domino to fall because he had to fall for the deep staters to protect the game that they were running against the American people by way of the president. And what do I mean by that? General Flynn knew where the bodies were buried. And as I'm going to get to in a minute, in his testimony to the Inspector General for Afghanistan reconstruction, he tells it like it is. This document alone, I will argue, is reason enough for them to have needed to cut his legs out from under him. Why? He actually threatened to truly restructure our intelligence community in accordance with our national interest. And that, of course, in line with what President Trump felt about the bureaucracy and national security apparatus broadly. That was in line with his vision. The Obama administration and Barack Obama himself, it was reported, the only official, I believe by name that it's been leaked, that they named to Trump officials as, don't let this guy be a part of your transition, don't let him ultimately assume any sort of office, was General Flynn. Why? Why was General Flynn the one they targeted? They will argue, oh, it's because he had these ties to nefarious Russian officials, which is just absurd based upon the factual record. And based upon, by the way, what he wrote himself about Russia as a threat. And also, I believe that he held the views that he did about Russia fighting terrorists with Russians, potentially, in part because he knew that China was the greater threat and we need to split off China from Russia. And oh, by the way, part of Russiagate, Spygate is that now China and Russia are closer than they've been in some time. Whereas Trump, I believe, wanted to split them knowing that it's better to have them against each other, one of them with us, than fighting together against us. I think this document is the single best illustration of why the deep state felt they needed to take Flynn out, which would destabilize the entire Trump administration, national security, and foreign policy, and make it very tough for him to then staff it up and populate it with people who actually agree with what he believes. Consequently, you've seen all the problems that have existed with these deep staters embedded, burrowed in, undermining and sabotaging the president's agenda. So when you think about why did they go for Flynn first of all, Flynn was the right-hand man as a national security advisor because he held the same worldview as the president. He knew where the bodies were buried in a corrupted, in some ways, or at the very least sclerotic national security and foreign policy establishment that was not best serving America's national interest, and he threatened the power and privilege of that establishment. How do we know that? Well, it wasn't just that General Flynn had the audacity to scream out, "Lock her up," with respect to Hillary Clinton, which that in and of itself probably made him persona non grata with that establishment. It wasn't just that he spoke out openly and honestly when he ran the DIA about the failures of the Obama administration and their disingenuous assessment of threats like ISIS, for example. He called it like it was, and he paid the price for being a truth teller. And as you'll see as we walk through this document a little bit, because I just think this is an amazing piece of history that we have and explains so well, at the very least, in terms of its symbolism. First of all, what the Trump agenda really is all about and was about. And then second, why Flynn had to be taken out, because he posed an existential threat to the deep staters. He probably would have uncovered where all the bodies were buried. And maybe the biggest shame of all is that it would appear, based upon the way that the assault on Flynn went down, that he didn't see that it was actually his own colleagues, the one enemy in terms of his personal livelihood, his ability to function in society, to serve our country. They were right in front of him. They were his colleagues. He was able to find all these jihadists around the world, make accurate, clear assessments. That's why he rose as high as he did, given how politically incorrect he is, which is really antithetical to how bureaucracies work. He missed those who had the long knives out for him that were right in front of him. And that is to our great detriment as a country, I believe. Let's take a quick break, and when we come right back, we'll delve in a little bit to this amazing document that you have to read. I'm going to tweet this out. I urge you to take a look at it over the weekend, this 10-page document, because it's really remarkable, and we'll walk through some of it right after this break. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on the Buck Sexton Show, back right after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton, and we're going to spend a significant portion, if not all of this hour, talking about General Flynn as a symbol of the far greater attack on those who are anti-establishment in America's national interest, and why he was such a seminal figure that had to be taken out from the perspective of those who wanted to torpedo the Trump presidency and ultimately violate the consent of the governed. And I talked about a little bit, teed up this interview that General Flynn gave with the Inspector General's office on Afghanistan reconstruction. I'm going to quote a little bit from this because these are just amazing words to hear from anyone who would be at a senior level in government, period. And it's to his great credit that he ended up in this position. He writes in part, or states in part, "Never mind not accomplishing our mission, but the severity of corruption in our own system, I think, is just unbelievable. The waste that I saw is unbelievable. You just sit there and go, you've got to be kidding me. Why did we do this? I think that somebody someday will sit down and do some very serious research with data, which they can discover about this problem. A friend of mine just did an assessment in Iraq. He was a very serious gentleman in this case. He's discovering how little data we actually have kept for the new military organization there. Secretary of Defense has just appointed our general in Iraq, U.S. Army 3rd Corps. It's amazing. His friend, conducting this assessment, did a good solid 45 days and went into theater. He has an extraordinary background there, but definitely in Iraq. He just told me the other day that it's like we're starting from scratch. In this era of data and information that we have all these things and all this stuff, but everybody goes and then takes the data when they leave. You visit the theater, and he says that he's in the process of writing a book, and part of it is how we've gotten away from that. We're such a strong country, but we've gotten away from the idea of actually how to win anything. Let me say that again. We are such a strong country, but we have gotten away from the idea of actually how to win anything. This is General Flynn in 2015. There's a machinery that is behind what we do, and it keeps us participating in the conflict because it generates wealth. It generates wealth all around and on both sides. Well, all sides. There are more than two sides. This is beyond impolitic. This would be career suicide for pretty much anyone in the national security apparatus to say. But here General Flynn is saying it on record. Okay, so here's General Flynn now talking about intelligence collection on the ground. At the beginning of the war, 2002 to 2012, those tasked with collecting intelligence got it because they got it conventionally where they got it, on the ground. Facebook didn't come around until 2005, and Twitter was barely there. The information revolution has only occurred in the last 10 years, if you want to stretch it, but really in the last 5 years. The war went on for a long time. But he says, regardless of what the intelligence out there told him, I could also read a really good report out of RAND, CSIS, or CNAS. Those are think tanks. If I'm switched on and really paying attention to open source back then, if I'm reading a variety of things to include history, I could probably know a lot more than the intelligence community is going to tell me. How is this possible? We spend billions of dollars on this. How can it be that this open source material tells you more than these intelligence analysts? The response from policymakers is always, what does the intel say? Remember, there is an inherent bias in the intel community because they want to get money. They want to exist, and they want to grow. And by the way, that goes for pretty much every bureaucracy in government. Even if you have people who mean the best, they go in wanting to serve us faithfully. It's near every bureaucracy, by its very nature, wants to grow bigger. No bureaucracy wants less power. Again, for General Flynn to be saying this is remarkable. And again, it shows why he needed to be taken out. Here's another part of this assessment that just has to drive you nuts. The narcotics today is worse than it's ever been. I don't think that there was a year that has gone by in our time in Afghanistan where the narcotics industry has had a bad year. I think it has been progressively moved up. There was a lot of things we did to try to reduce that, but narcotics was not a big mission of the international force there. However, it was driving a lot of the funding for the enemy that we were facing. And then he goes on to talk a little bit about some of the corrupt officials, tribal leaders that they had to deal with on the ground. Here's what he says about them in part. I was in one of these tribal leaders' offices, and it was not pretty when we confronted some of his Air Force generals. You know what? Arrest the guy. This is a combat zone. Arrest him. If they want to fight us, fine. Fight us. He's talking about the two-faced nature of some of the folks they had to deal with on the ground there. Fight us, but arrest them. They should have arrested every one of them and thrown them all in jail. I will tell you that all of the threats that came out of that, from those that I remember, I thought we should have arrested them. And he's talking about a particular shooting that occurred. They should have been arrested and brought up on charges by us, not by International Assistance Force and not under some lousy Afghan court. There are a lot of guys that should have been arrested. You have to have accountability. That is part of the problem with instilling confidence in a population. They see it, the corruption, happening right in front of their eyes. We see it happening, and we don't look the other way. We actually enable it. Here's another quote from General Flynn. The intelligence system, I thought, was very accurate on the who is who in the zoo there, so to speak. Who is who in the leadership of those we were facing in Afghanistan and also the members of the international coalition. The international coalition was also corrupt and also saw the U.S. money coming in and took advantage of it. Our money. Don't think it was just the Afghans. There was a lot of intel about other countries and people that were there taking advantage of deals, including us. That is why I say there is probably criminal cases waiting to be had against people who found weaknesses in our system. Even soldiers and other government officials found weaknesses in our system to make money. The tactical intelligence and the reporting that was captured in terms of written down and database in some computer systems that describe corruption was unbelievable. There was plenty of it. And this is another really important quote, and it's depressing to read this, but it has to be read. As intelligence makes its way up higher, it gets consolidated and really watered down. It gets politicized. It gets politics because once policymakers get their hands on it, and frankly, once operational commanders get their hands on it, they put their twist to it. Operational commanders, State Department policymakers, and Department of Defense policymakers are going to be inherently rosy in their assessments. They will be unaccepting of hard-hitting intelligence. Then what are they doing out there? What have we been doing out there? Money wasted, watered down, politicized intelligence, inability or unwillingness to round up those flouting the law, thumbing their noses at us. It gets worse. In a statement on mission statements and self-rating, General Flynn says, "To me, this is a really important point. If you go back and look at the mission statements for every battalion and every brigade from the beginning of the war, they are essentially all the same. It is defeat and destroy the enemy and protect the population." Okay, sounds rational. This was true for every battalion commander and every brigade commander from a U.S. side. Defeat the enemy and protect the population. So they all went in for whatever their rotation was, 9 months or 6 months, and were given that mission, accepted that mission, and executed that mission. Then they all said when they left, they accomplished that mission. Every single commander. Not one commander is going to leave Afghanistan or Iraq or any place. Not one is going to leave and say, you know what, we didn't accomplish our mission. So the next guy that shows up finds it, their area of the theater, screwed up after a great right seat ride. They do their mission analysis once they're on the ground, and then they come back and go, man, this is really bad. But the last battalion, regiment, or other commander, accomplished their mission. They have all these wonderful stats about what they did. I'm telling you that this is true from 2002 until today. From ambassadors down to the low level, they all say, we are doing a great job. Really? So if we're doing such a great job, why does it feel like we are losing? He goes on to say this, I was supposed to testify this Thursday in front of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, and you really should read some of that old testimony from General Flynn. Chairman Johnson's committee, but they moved it. I'm going to walk through my testimony. My testimony is on ISIS in the Middle East. Remember, this is late 2015, and the threat to the homeland. I've been working on my testimony for about a week and doing a lot of research. Every measurable activity is failing. So when you look at Afghanistan, every single measurable activity is failing. If General John Campbell were to sit here today and say, that's not true because we built more schools, we have more cars on the road, really? Afghanistan is better today than it was? There are more people, I guess, in the city of Kabul. So, really, we've done better? So every single operational commander, battalion commander, regimental, every single one of them came into Afghanistan and said the situation was not like they thought it was, and when they left, that they had defeated the enemy. We've convinced the population and helped the population. And I said, here it is. It is in great shape, and they love us down here. Then you come in and say, okay, I'm here, and I have a year. My first 30 days, I think this is really bad. But I guarantee you that if you look at the outbriefs, you will see nothing but goodness. Believe me, I was looking at them for 10 years. I saw this in Iraq and really dug into it in Afghanistan. And it goes on and on from here. I really urge you to read this assessment because it tells you everything you need to know about the existential threat that General Flynn posed to an establishment that was in effect propping up failed missions. And if it's for the reasons that General Flynn has alleged, it should really call into question a lot of what we're doing overseas. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. We'll be back with Sidney Powell, General Flynn's lead counsel, right after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sidney Powell, who is the lead counsel for General Flynn and also author of the bestseller, License to Lie, Exposing Corruption in the Department of Justice. Sidney, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, the pleasure's all mine. And let's get right to the big news this week, which is that General Flynn, after much back and forth with Judge Sullivan, will be working to, and you can tell me where we are in the process, withdraw his guilty plea. Tell us where we are.
Well, the judge just entered an order today granting us until Friday to file further briefing on that issue. And, of course, we have a sentencing memoranda due this week. And then he's scheduled the government to file a reply brief on our next filing. So he's moved the sentencing to February 27 at 11 a.m. in his courtroom. We have a massive additional motion to file. We are working day and night to get it done, and it will be even more revealing and explosive than our prior filings put together. This case is an extraordinary prosecutorial abuse. The government has been hiding the evidence that shows they lied and Mr. Flynn was honest. They still are hiding a lot of it, but the whole story is going to come out before I quit.
Well, let me ask you a fundamental question, which is, and I believe you corresponded with Attorney General Barr before you took General Flynn's case when he switched counsel. Attorney General Barr, it doesn't seem like would suffer fools gladly. And if this case is really the most poisonous fruit of the most poisonous tree, why wouldn't he dismiss it altogether?
Well, if what really should happen now is that the government agrees to our motion to withdraw if there's any integrity left in the Department of Justice, because Mr. Van Grack himself, we filed yesterday and then corrected one today, a document demonstrating that Mr. Van Grack deleted from the statement of offense that was essentially crammed down Mr. Flynn's throat the very language that he then wanted Mr. Flynn to admit to in the Eastern District of Virginia in the related case of Mr. Flynn's former business partner that they were determined Mr. Flynn testify to. Well, if Mr. Flynn had done what Mr. Van Grack wanted, he would have committed a false statement offense, and he would have committed perjury on the witness stand against Mr. Rafikian. And Mr. Van Grack knew that, not only because he had deleted the precise language from the statement of offense because Mr. Flynn would not agree to it, but because he held in his hand FBI 302s of a Covington lawyer that said Mr. Flynn said exactly what he'd said and it was truthful.
Another basic question before we get into some of the specifics is what caused General Flynn to change his posture from essentially agreeing to the charges, complying with everything that the government asked, getting to the sentencing room where Judge Sullivan extraordinarily, and it can never be stricken really, at least from the public record, called General Flynn in effect a traitor, if not outright a traitor. What caused General Flynn to change his posture and decide to fight what I believe, and millions of Americans I think believe, is a grave injustice?
Well, essentially, Covington that represented him before had an enormous and non-consentable conflict of interest that the general was not informed of. It's absolutely outrageous that they did not withdraw from representing him when it became apparent that their FARA filing, the FARA filing they had prepared, was in the scope of special counsel's rifle for prosecution on the FARA filing that they had done. That creates what's called a non-consentable conflict of interest. They should have withdrawn then at the very latest. Instead, there are all kinds of reasons that will be apparent in our next filing that explain everything that happened thereafter, and it's nothing short of stunning.
Can you tell us a little bit, sort of the three most egregious acts of the government that have led us to where we are today, where you're trying to withdraw this guilty plea?
Well, one of the first is slipping an FBI agent into what was billed to Mr. Trump and Mr. Flynn and a third person who had a security clearance as a presidential daily briefing when he was in fact there to spy on and record any statement made by General Flynn and use it for baseline and or further prosecution by the FBI. That is revealed in the Inspector General's report. Another huge one is Mr. Van Grack himself knowingly taking the language out of the plea agreement because Mr. Flynn wouldn't agree to it, and then trying to make him testify to the opposite and admit the opposite in the Eastern District of Virginia, threatening him about doing that and then blowing up his cooperation because he wouldn't lie. It's just outrageous and stunning. And it's fully documented. We attached to our filing today and 2 days ago, we yellow highlighted it. He had redlined it, where he deleted that language and then was hell-bent on making Mr. Flynn admit something that he knew wasn't true.
I think it bears noting that virtually all of this stems from a lawful conversation that General Flynn had, several conversations that General Flynn had with a foreign counterpart during a presidential transition about issues of state. Uh, in the first place, I mean,
And for which the FBI had recordings and transcripts, so they knew exactly what he had said. There was no question about it at all. It was purely a perjury trap. It was designed to be a perjury trap. They didn't let him know he was even an object or subject of an investigation. It's so un-American and offensive, it makes my blood boil.
and it makes my blood boil, quite frankly, as well. The judge, in responding to some of the prior allegations that you put forth about the government misconduct, seemed to, and I'll say it in layman's terms, slap down those arguments. Do you think he will
Well,
be?
that's exactly what he did. And not only that, but he accused me of an ethical violation, which even lawyers who hate me got on Twitter to defend me against.
So what do you think? What does that say for the rest of the case? And do you believe that justice can be done under these constraints?
Well, I think the more we proceed in this litigation, the more the abuses and problems in our criminal justice system will be apparent, so that not only all of America can see how broken it is, but the entire world will see how broken it is. So the question is, how big a black eye does the government want, and how much does half of Washington want its dirty laundry exposed?
Is there any other court that General Flynn could appeal his case to if it doesn't break the way that you want it to break?
Yes, the Court of Appeals and then the Supreme Court.
And in your view, what ultimately would justice look like for General Flynn?
Allow the plea to be withdrawn and dismiss the outrageous charges with a statement that General Flynn was innocent and the case was manufactured.
Sidney Powell, I thank you so much for joining us today and for your yeoman's efforts on General Flynn's behalf. I think myself, and I speak for millions of Americans, believe this has been a grave injustice, and thank you for the work you're doing in defending him.
Thank you, Ben. It is the most egregious injustice I have ever witnessed.
This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on The Buck Sexton Show. We'll be right back just after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton here as we round out our final hour, hour 3. And you might recall at the start of this show, one of the F's in that alliterative sequence was fraud, and I talked about the impeachment fraud a little bit. You may or may not have seen the report yesterday about fraud of another kind, and that is the fraud, not only particular claims of fraudulence, but almost the entire fraudulence, as Scott Johnson of Powerline has argued. That is Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. And we've talked about Omar in the past, her criminality, corruption. I've written about at length her collusion with Islamists, both foreign and domestic. And I've also noted I will have a book coming out next month on Ilhan Omar, not just Ilhan Omar, the individual, with her collusion, her corruption, her corrosive beliefs, but also where they come from, what the consequences are for America, and how it is those beliefs that actually have taken over the Democratic Party. So that when President Trump says that Ilhan Omar is the face of the Democratic Party, it actually is true. It is actually borne out in the numbers, in the statements, and in the actions of certainly Nancy Pelosi's House. And I've never disclosed the title of that book. On Monday, I'll disclose it, and maybe I'll disclose the cover too. None of this has ever been put out on social media. You can't find it on Amazon yet. We're going to crash the market in February. I'll let you know about the date, the publication date shortly. But the book is done, and I'm very excited to share it. And of course, on the eve of the publication, we get this news yesterday from David Steinberg, formerly of PJ Media. This is writing in the Blaze. And Steinberg has been one of the most dogged reporters on all of the personal insanity regarding Ilhan Omar's family. And I've talked about before the allegations of marriage fraud, the allegations that I think are quite credible based upon the evidence that she did, in fact, marry her actual biological brother. Even if it wasn't her brother, by the way, if you look at the fact pattern, and we'll walk through this, and I walk through this at great length in my book, incidentally, it still appears that it was a fraudulent marriage, whether or not it was her brother or not, based upon the timeline, the fact that she was cohabitating with her faith-based partner. Prior to that point, there was no formal divorce. It's a convoluted web, but here are the facts as reported by David Steinberg yesterday in this bombshell. He tweeted this out and wrote an article corresponding to it as well. Big Ilhan Omar update. Federal investigators finally seem to be reviewing the overwhelming evidence against Ilhan Omar, and at least 3 agencies are considering her case. The FBI, the D of Ed Inspector General, Department of Education, and ICE. He goes on to say, in October 2019, the FBI held a formal meeting to discuss a file of evidence against Ilhan Omar. Steinberg was invited but did not attend. He submitted new information for the FBI through an attorney. The FBI has since found the evidence compelling enough to share with 2 other agencies. The Department of Education Inspector General is considering evidence that Ilhan married a UK citizen in 2009, perhaps to commit student loan fraud and other education fraud. She attended North Dakota State University from 2009 through June 11. The marriage only lasted from 2009 through June 11. Like I said, if you actually follow the fact pattern, it's inevitable that you come to this conclusion it was fraudulent. She still lived with her first husband throughout that time frame. ICE is considering evidence that Ilhan Omar married a UK citizen in 2009, perhaps to commit immigration fraud. Government agencies rarely acknowledge an investigation. For now, I can confirm that the FBI chose to share evidence with at least these 2 agencies. And the story is only going to mushroom from here. And incidentally, this doesn't even cover the tax fraud, which it appears Ilhan Omar almost definitionally committed in having to amend her forms after the fact when she was not married to the person who she claimed to be jointly filing taxes with. It's a crazy, tangled web. I get to it in great detail in my book. Steinberg's reporting has been exceptional on this. We'll keep following the story, and like I said, I'll be very keen on sharing some information about my book when we come back on Monday. Now, before the weekend, I also want to get to a grab bag of other stories that caught my eye this week that you might have missed in the cloud of the fraud that is this impeachment hysteria. This is from the Epic Times, Mark Tapscott. Federal judge orders Justice Department to explain why Awan documents are being kept secret. Remember that? The Awan brothers scandal? Naturally, Judicial Watch, which does the job effectively of the House, which is oversight, has been very diligently pushing to reveal all the information about how it is these Awan brothers seemingly perpetrated a fraud on all these Congress people whose computers they had access to, who worked on the committees that dealt with the most sensitive of national security intelligence information. A judge is finally pushing the Justice Department to fess up on why they're keeping these documents secret. Daily Caller, as mammoth Obamacare fight looms, Democrats ignore Supreme Court in presidential debate. Not only did they ignore the Supreme Court, they also ignored Obamacare, which is collapsing in the courts. Stories they don't want you to hear about. Naturally, none of the Democrats want to be on the record about their Supreme Court justices, whereas once again, President Trump was open, honest, and transparent about his potential list of judges. Imagine that, and he kept his word. Here's another story that should just drive you nuts when Americans are targeted, but we have our adversaries running free here to spew their propaganda. This is from IPT, John Rosamondo. Iranian regime-linked cleric protests Soleimani killing with CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and NIAC, which is basically a propaganda group on behalf of the Iranian regime in America. And by the way, several members of Congress have actually put out questions and potentially legislation as well dealing with the fact that NIAC is an unregistered foreign agent operating on our soil. And this Detroit area Shiite imam spewed propaganda from effectively the pews with CARE and NIAC standing by. That's enemy propaganda on our soil on behalf of Soleimani and the Iranian regime. I talked yesterday at length about why the long knives were out for Bernie Sanders. Well, seemingly confirming exactly what I had indicated. Yesterday, Reuters reported Bernie Sanders climbs in popularity, now tied with Biden among registered voters, according to a Reuters Ipsos poll. It's actually interestingly how this is boomeranging on the Democrats. He gets into this spat with Elizabeth Warren. The long knives come out for him. CNN works with Elizabeth Warren to sort of tag team Bernie. Actually, I believe he's raised millions of dollars off of this attack. I think he had President Trump tweeting about him earlier today about how it's again being rigged against Bernie. It's really interesting how the establishments work in both parties, isn't it? And like in the Republican Party, it seems to be backfiring on the Democrats. And I think we're going to show that democracy may well rule in the Democratic Party. It's what none of the establishment wants, even though they claim to care about democracy dying in darkness. well, actually, they want to rig the deck against him. Now, whether it's on Elizabeth Warren's behalf or Joe Biden's behalf, or maybe some dark horse that we don't know about, is yet to be seen. But it's certainly worth keeping an eye on this. And relatedly, I just found this hilarious in some ways, but also, again, you can sort of sympathize with them to the extent you set aside that they are communists and they're in bed with Islamists and the like. This was reported by, I believe, a Politico reporter who covers progressive politics, tweeted yesterday. The popular pro-Bernie Sanders subreddit, R. Sanders for President, says it is, quote, removing all content from CNN for the foreseeable future because they have abandoned their journalistic integrity. CNN's debate, quote, has been criticized across the entire ideological spectrum of media. And then it goes on to say, CNN moderator spent the entire debate asking slanted questions obviously designed to weaken Americans' confidence in Senator Sanders, the current frontrunner in the first 3 primary states. Again, it's amazing how you can sort of sympathize with them to the extent that you understand that they want to destroy us. But we all agree on CNN, so there's something to be unified about in this country. Lastly, quickly, great article in the New Republic, shockingly, on the plot to level the administrative state, which I urge you to check out, and I hope we do deconstruct the administrative state, as the Trump administration has been working to do. We're going to have to leave it right there. I want to thank you for taking these last 2 days to share with me. Really appreciate all the kind comments online and elsewhere. I want to thank Buck for giving me the opportunity to fill his big shoes. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you again on Monday for another action-packed show of The Buck Sexton Show. Thanks so much.